Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Cole Phillips, author of The Adventure of the Twisted Truths and host of The Book and Dagger, the YouTube channel where we talk about everything fiction and fantasy. Today's video is going to be part 3 of Faith and Fantasy, the third and final video in my series of videos in which I talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, and that is the subject of faith and fantasy, and how I believe that fantasy can help strengthen faith, and fantasy can also be a very useful tool for people who might otherwise not be willing to consider accepting Christian worldviews. If you've not seen my other two videos, please go check them out. It's a subject I'm really passionate about. And without further ado, I want to get into some more topics of how I believe faith, how fantasy is inspired by faith, and how fantasy can also strengthen faith. One thing I would like to talk about is there's some very interesting parallels between faith and a believer's walk with Christ and many fantasy series. In many fantasy series, it is very common for the kind of the protagonist, the main hero, or sometimes um, multiple members to undergo trials and tests. For example, in Star Wars, to become a Jedi Knight, there's tests that must be undergone. Like Luke has to face his fears on Dagobah when he's trained to be a Jedi. In the Wheel of Time series, women who wish to become Aes Sedai must pass through these rings where they kind of see all these alternate futures, and they kind of have to face them and realize this is not real. This is all a test. But it's they'll like see someone they love, they'll die in the vision, and or something like that, and something that was meant to test them and see if they're ready to be an Aes Sedai. In other works of fantasy, that's also a very common thing where the main character, they may enter a sacred place or like this old temple, and they'll like see these visions, or they'll just have to go through this, like pass this test of some kind to help determine whether or not they're ready to be whatever the essentially Jedi or Aes Sedai or whatever the main essentially the order that keeps the peace or fights for the light is. Um, this is actually a very me personally, I find this very interesting. I didn't think about it till recently, um, but this is very interesting because a lot of times in the Bible and in modern life, God will give his followers tests. Like, for example, when you think about Job, God allowed Satan to basically take everything away from Job and put him through great tribulations and trials, which at the moment Job must have been like, why is all this happening to me? Like, a lot of times we as humans, we will be going through life and something will happen. I know me personally, there's been a lot of times when I go through life and something's happened to me. I've been like, why would God allow this? Like, why? And looking back, I can see like how it's grew me in the moment. It allowed me to grow closer to God and just reach out to Him more. And it is very, very rare that you will find a fantasy story that does not have some kind of section where, like I said, the main characters, they go through this old site, or they pass through this like enchanted forest or whatever, and they see visions, or they undergo a test or a trial or tribulation of some kind that eventually will help them, as they eventually allow, because of that test or tribulation, eventually they grow as a character, and it helps them reach their end goal, whether it be saving their city or defeating the main villain or whatever. This is just something I found very interesting and hadn't really ever thought about till recently, but it's almost a staple in every fantasy series or TV show or book series, where the main character will enter some kind of strange place and see these visions or undergo a test. And it's just one way I think that it really shows that fantasy oftentimes mirrors the Bible, and I believe that can help people grow closer. If you're a Christian, you're going through some struggles in life, and you're watching a show or reading a book series, and you see the main character undergoing tests of some kind, it can help you realize, hey, God is testing me here. This is my test in real life, and ultimately help me grow closer to God, which is a lot of times hard to see in the moment, and a lot of us don't see it in the moment. I know a lot of times I don't see them in the moment, but looking back, we'll see, okay, God allowed that to happen in my life to strengthen my faith. And the final thing I would like to talk about that I find very interesting is so this has always been a personal belief of mine that a lot of a lot of fantasy stories and like tales and like legends and myths like throughout in ancient history passed down over time or directly inspired by biblical events. And this is backed up by the fact that in many cultures around the world, you can see they have their stories, the legends of a man who built a boat to escape like a worldwide flood. Like this is like hinting at Noah's flood in the Bible. And there's so many different flood legends all around the world. Another way I think this is connected is it's very interesting because a lot of times in modern fantasy and fiction, especially if it's like a medieval kind of world, medieval fantasy kind of world, there's oftentimes a like old wizards are often portrayed as old men, long beards, staff, performing wonders and stuff. And I personally think this is a lot of legends and stuff were largely inspired by Moses, for the story of Moses in the Bible, for example. Like, I mean, when you think about it, if you at the time when the Israelites were being held captive in Egypt, the Egyptians they had they believed in all these different gods. They had their magicians, their sorcerers, everything like that. And when you think about it from the Egyptians' point of view, this old man shows up out of nowhere with a staff, walks before them, says he's the servant of a god more powerful than theirs, and then proceeds to send 10 plagues upon them. He and then he also beats their own dark magicians and wise men in a duel, like when he throws on his staff and comes a snake. And the Pharaoh calls forth his magicians and wise men, they throw down their staffs and they become snakes. And then Moses' staff swallows up their snakes. And then Moses plunges, the power of God plunges Egypt into darkness for 3 days, turns the Nile River into blood, strikes the cattle dead. All this crazy stuff is going on. And if you're like an Egyptian or someone from the surrounding areas and you're hearing the stories and you're seeing this happen in real life, you're going to be like, who is this man? And then you're probably going to tell stories about him and pass those stories down to your kids. And then over time, those kids are going to tell their kids. And the stories are going to go down over time. And eventually, we get myths and legends and stories of old men with staves, wizards, because the Egyptians wouldn't really know what to call it, or like as it gets passed down, it gets forgotten that it was God and his prophets who did it, and they would eventually come to call it magic and tell stories about it. I just always found this. I think this is a very interesting link between the Bible and legends. I do think a lot of legends and folklore and stuff was directly inspired by a lot of events that took place in the Old Testament. I do also believe that Pharaoh, like his magicians and his dark sorcerers, his wise men or whatever, a lot of people have said, oh, they must have been, just essentially what our modern day magicians are, just con men doing tricks and stuff. I actually believe that they were real, actually practicing magic, and that their magic was essentially power gifted to them by Satan, or potentially God allowed their staves to actually transform, and they were actually common, going like they didn't think it would actually happen. They threw it down, and actually became something. So they were like, oh wow, that's crazy. But I'm actually more inclined to believe that they were actually magicians. It's never explicitly said in the Bible. We don't know. This is me speculating, and I would encourage you to do more research on this. But like for example, in the Old Testament, God tells the Israelites not to practice dark magic. We see throughout the Bible examples of people called sorcerers, like Simon the sorcerer, the witch of Endor. We see them practicing these evil things. And a lot of people have speculated that, oh, they were just con men or whatever. I personally believe that they were empowered by Satan, perhaps using like his demonic like power and stuff. And this is why God forbade them from using magic, because magic in the real magic is what we call it, but in reality it's demonic power that they're taking from Satan. And that this is why God forbade its use in the Old Testament, and why Moses had to have this clash, this kind of battle with the magicians and the wise men of Pharaoh, to show, because God was showing them, hey, my power is greater than Satan's. And the Egyptians, they didn't see God physically, they didn't see Satan physically, but they saw God's servant, they saw Satan's servants fighting, and God's servant came out on top, showing that his power is ultimately supreme. And I just believe I believe legends, stories of this were just passed down, and I believe this is why Christians should ultimately use fiction and fantasy. I believe it is a very useful tool to help further the kingdom of God. But yeah, let me know your comments down below, and I will see you guys for the next